Okay, chapter 13, part 1. Part 1 is the red blood cells. Part 2 will be the white blood cells. So this is complicated, so I'm going to try to make it as simple as I can to think about what you need to review. So we're talking about blood health and the components of blood. So first we have to understand what blood is made of, and then we have to understand what nutrients are important for healthy blood, and then we have to understand what happens if we have deficiencies of these nutrients. So there's 4 components of blood. I'll talk about where blood cells are made, and then which are the most common types of blood cells. So the overview is we need blood. We need blood to move nutrients, oxygen, take out waste, move our hormones. So obviously it's important. Erythrocytes are the largest, most prevalent blood cell, the red blood cells. And these are the ones that contain hemoglobin, which is a protein which carries oxygen. And iron is also intricately attached in hemoglobin. So the components of blood, there's a red blood cells, a white blood cells, the plasma. So when you to check your health of your blood, they'll often do a centrifuge. You'll take the blood, put it in a little tube like this, spin it down, and they'll be able to see, whether your percent of red blood cells is normal or not. So the hemoglobin or the concentration, the hematocrit, are ways to determine your blood health as far as having enough red blood cells. And then, of course, the white blood cells is also important. And that's, you can see here, the platelets is the fourth. The platelets is the protein, are also in the blood. So here we have the nutrients then. So mainly we'll look right ahead at the nutrients that are essential for blood health. And also noting that one way to prevent problems with blood is not losing too much blood. So we talk a lot about homeostasis, but notice it's hemostasis is when we have adequate blood supplies because we don't have a break in our vessels. So one of the first things we talk about is what nutrient is involved to prevent a breakdown of the vessel where we lose blood from bleeding or hemorrhage. So you see hemorrhage is losing too much blood. So that's the vitamin K. So it's the first nutrient we kind of discuss is vitamin K. So let's just take a look at that. So here we have the blood. You can look at this little video later, but these are the mechanisms for a break in a blood vessel is a clotting factors formation, but then you can see that vitamin K and calcium are particularly important. When these are inactivated until the triggering, then the clotting factor will activate the production of prothrombin and thrombin. You might have heard of these, which then can form fibrin. So basically, it's the steps that are made to kind of create this netting so that you don't lose too much blood. That's one of the most important things, that we have enough vitamin K so that we can form fibrin, which will keep the blood from losing too much blood. It causes hemostasis. So that's one of the nutrients that's essential. So when we look at vitamin K, that's a fat-soluble vitamin that usually we have plenty of because we make 10 or 15% of that in our gut if we have healthy gut bacteria. Babies are born without any, so they're often either given a shot or if you wait a few days, it will develop. And then older people might also have lower intake of vitamin K products. So where do we get vitamin K? It's generally in foods that are green. So all the greens, again, it's another reason why we need to eat a lot of vegetables and a little bit of oil, but basically you can see it's greens. So vitamin K is somewhat in our body and also in our diet. So then the next thing we'll look at is how do we make our blood cells. Erythropoiesis is the making of the red blood cells. So where are they produced? What nutrients do you need to produce them? So this you can keep studying this chart because I find this the most helpful for this chapter. So you notice the white blood cells we'll talk about in the next video and the red blood cells, and then there's the platelets. But mostly we're going to talk about the blood cells. So here, just note this now and then remember it. And that is you need vitamin B12 and folate are involved in the formation of red blood cells. So if you don't have enough of either one of these vitamins, then you can't make enough erythrocytes or red blood cells. So this is essential, and you'll see what happens if you don't have enough of either one of these. And then the B6 and iron, if you're lacking in either one or both of these minerals and vitamins, then you might have a lower number of erythrocytes because you're making them, but you can't make enough because you don't have enough iron or B12s to, so you have a fewer number of red blood cells. And vitamin C and copper are also important in this erythrocyte. So those are the minerals we'll talk about in this first video. B12 and folate go together. B6 and iron go together. And then attached to that are copper and vitamin C. So basically here, the erythropoiesis, or the making of red blood cells, is absolutely essential because it carries oxygen. And then it takes the carbon dioxide away. So it takes the waste away and it brings in the oxygen that's needed. So that's the hemoglobin is the iron carrying protein. So the hemoglobin is in these red blood cells and it carries the oxygen. So every hemoglobin can carry 4 molecules of oxygen, and we'll see that. Here's the hemoglobin right here. So you can see it's a complicated protein, and the iron can attach to the oxygen. So you have to have iron, or you can't carry oxygen. And you can see that the alpha chains. So we learned about protein. So protein's important, iron's important for us to carry adequate oxygen to our system. We know we need oxygen for ATP production. So if you don't get enough iron or enough oxygen, then we can have what's called anemia, which I think we've all heard about this particular disease. It's a low red blood cell production or low hemoglobin production. So if you don't have enough hemoglobin, enough of the protein, then you can't carry oxygen either. And then it can also be caused by we mentioned the loss or destruction of blood. So if you lose blood because a clotting factor doesn't work, or if you have something that's destroying, there's some bacteria can actually break down the proteins in the blood. So normal red blood cells, if you saw a picture of a red blood cell, it's called normocytic. That means it's a normal size. Normochromic means a normal color. So you can look at the color, you can look at the size to determine what is going on. There's many, many types of anemia. We'll just look at a couple. So a large red blood cell would be macrocytic, so a normocytic, macrocytic, or sometimes megaloblastic. And then a microchromic, you might have, normal, or you might have a light colored. So here's a picture of that. Here's a macrocytic. So these are extra large red blood cells because there's not enough folate or B12 to help form the red blood cells. They get large. Or they can get hypochromic, means not bright colored, so kind of off, sort of tan instead of red. And microcytic means they're small. So these are small and not very red. These are large and kind of bulky. So these are both problems with the red blood cells, that they don't look as good as they should. Okay, so then moving on, we will just look briefly at the different causes of anemia. So we can see low red blood cell production, not enough hemoglobin, or loss of blood, or the other ways that these can be destroyed by infections I already mentioned, but also if you don't have enough folate or B12, you just don't make enough of them. Sickle cell, people with sickle cell anemia, they can't carry very much oxygen because of the shape of the cells. And that causes this macrocytic megaloblastic, so large cell or large immature cells. And then lack of iron or lack of protein so you don't have enough hemoglobin, would cause this a tiny cell that often is hypochromic, not very red in color. So those are things you would notice if you were in a lab and you're like, well, I wonder what this person's problem is. So normal would be normocytic, small is microcytic, large is macrocytic. And there's an example of a large cell because the DNA is not sufficient to make, so it kind of slows down the production. It just makes these big globules that don't move very well, and they actually break down much easier. They're not as sturdy. The cells are not as sturdy. And normally red blood cells live about 120 days, but if they're macrocytic, they may not live as long, and they're not as good you can't carry as much oxygen with fewer red blood cells. So here is iron deficiency anemia. So if you have too little iron, you can test your iron in your blood, and you might have different stages of anemia. So if you have not been eating much food with irons, for instance, then you might be a stage 1, where you just have a depleted store, but your symptoms, you have no symptoms, where these are the symptoms if you were to have anemia. Then as you get to stage 2, you'll have some noticing of symptoms, but usually it's stage 3 when you start seeing the change in the blood cells and you start noticing these symptoms. So it takes a long time to become iron deficient. It doesn't just happen overnight. And the same way, it takes a long time to build up your iron if you are iron deficient. So you can't just take a pill one night and feel great the next day. So the things that are important to maintain your blood cells are these nutrients, which is what is covered in this chapter. And I can't just make sure you go over all these. B6, B12 we talked about. C is going to help iron absorption. K prevents loss of blood. And we mentioned iron is what's carrying the oxygen. And copper is also important because it transports iron from one place to another. So you need the copper to move it around. So the iron is the part of the hemoglobin, and also there's something called myoglobin, which carries oxygen in the muscles. And it has other functions too. And then just beware of here it's just talking about the needs, how much do you need. So women need more than men because they lose a lot in their menstruation, at least during their childbearing years. And then if you look at where it goes, so the iron, we don't lose that much iron, but it's stored, some of it's stored in our bone, some of it's stored in our liver, some of it's stored in our muscles. So it's kind of circulating all throughout our body to keep us in good health, because obviously that's the most important thing, is getting oxygen. Folate was the other, besides iron, is the other mineral or vitamin that we need. So this is important for several functions besides formulating the red blood cells. But it can prevent cancer. You can take it as a synthetic supplement if you can't maybe get it in your body, enough in your body. So you can see the sources of vitamin folate are often, again, in leafy greens, just like in vitamin K, dried beans, bread, milk, and yogurt. So it's not a lot of places for folate. So if you don't have a healthy diet, if you're not eating a good balance, it's easy to not get enough folate, and that will definitely affect your blood health. And then the next one we talk about is B12. So that was important to work with folate to produce healthy red blood cells. So where do you get B12? B12 is in only animal products. So you have to make sure that if you're a vegetarian, you've got to figure out a supplement that you can take. So it's only milk, eggs, and meats. So that's a really important mineral to make sure you're getting. And it's important because it doesn't, you have to have, for B12 to absorb, you have to have protein. So sometimes if you, some people as they get older don't absorb B12 as well because they don't have the acidity in their stomach to help the protein to be triggered to attach to B12. So it's kind of a complicated system, but basically as you're eating food with B12 in your stomach, it attaches, the B12 protein combination attaches to another protein so it can be absorbed later on in your GI tract. So it's pretty important. And then the last thing is copper. Just noticing that copper was another mineral that helps iron to be absorbed or transported. So it's kind of a very micronutrient. You don't need very much of it, but it has an important function also for blood clotting. So for blood health in general, it's important. And where can we get copper? We need very little bit, just a few micrograms a day. And the sources are, again, in nuts, beans, meat. Only in liver, though. The liver is a very high source. It's kind of everywhere, a lot of different food groups, as long as you're getting a variety of food groups. And there's just one last thing you'll want to review, and that is if you don't, there is a disease, just like we've talked about sickle cell being a genetic disease. There's another one called Wilson's disease where you actually absorb too much copper. And it's interesting just because copper is we need so little of it, just that 10 milligrams would kill you basically, but just a few micrograms. If you get too much, this situation is you actually absorb too much and it damages your liver, and often people need liver transplants. So, okay, so those are the minerals you have to remember is the copper and iron, and then these 4 vitamins in addition to folate. So review that and email me if you have questions. Okay, thank you.